All right, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jack Butler. I am, the founder of the Fairfield Gadfly Group, which is hosting this event. To my left is Dr. Grant. To my right is Lewis Butler. They've agreed to participate in tonight's debate, the subject of which is immigration. And the purpose of this debate is to explore in greater depth the differences in opinion that have appeared on this issue, even on a campus generally recognized to be as conservative as Hillsdale's. There are differences on this issue, even on the right side of the even among the right side of the political spectrum. So I look forward to exploring these differences of opinion in the next hour or so. Just briefly, the format of the debate: we will have 10 minutes of opening statements from each of the participants, followed by 5-minute responses from each participant, after which will come 25 minutes of Q&A from you, the audience. So I encourage you to ask as many questions as you can within that time period, as long as they're good. I don't want silly questions. After that, there will be 2.5 minutes from each debate participant to rebut, make closing remarks, etc. So with that being said, let us begin with the coin flip. Go ahead and... So, heads or tails?
I'll call heads. Always heads.
All right.
Independently, you verified this coin is indeed two-sided.
He's doing this because I gave him a double-headed coin beforehand.
All right. Tails.
Yes.
All right, Dr. Grant, would you like to go first or second?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I'll begin whenever you begin, and I'll just hold up my fingers to let you know how many minutes we have left.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe when it reaches 10 minutes, make it very clear to me I need to shut up.
Okay.
I'll take care of that.
You'll take care of that?
Yes.
Good. All right. Be brutal if necessary. Okay. Anybody who's heard me talk on this at all is going to know I'm going to say roughly what I'm going to say in my basic thesis. But I do have to say, so that Jack mentioned there's debate on this issue at the college, and I actually, although I'm striding on this, I feel it's a bit of a hopeless cause. I mean, the proponents of mass unlimited immigration have tried 5 times in the last 13 years to ram amnesty through Congress. It's been defeated by popular pressure each time, but they only have to succeed once, and I have a feeling they will. But once more into the breach at any rate. My position is that we need to secure our border to secure American rights due to the problems of crime and terrorism which are attendant to the current immigration situation, and that immigration, even legal immigration, needs to be drastically curtailed for 2 reasons. First, we are undermining the possibility of free government and decent communities by encouraging immigration from cultures hostile to limited government and the free market. Second, we have very high unemployment and welfare rates. We don't need large numbers of immigrants right now, and there's no injustice in not admitting more people into our existing social contract. The current view is not driven by what I would describe as a libertarian open borders argument, but more by the Rawlsian lens, which the idea popularized by John Rawls and common to our bipartisan ruling class, that we have to be concerned with the least among us above all else, and this includes people from foreign cultures who need to, because they're not as economically beneficial a position as we are, at least allegedly, need to be allowed into the country. This view is combined with the crass interest of both Democrats who want reliable voters, immigrants coming into the country under our post-1965 system vote about 75% consistently for Democratic candidates, with the crass interest of Republicans. The Republican ruling class likes heelot labor for big business. I would oppose this current view with the founders' view, which is the common good of American citizens, existing American citizens, which is not served, I will argue, by the current system. So now I'll try and elaborate on the problems with what I take to be the problems with the current post-1965 situation. I'm using 1965 as a benchmark because that's when our immigration system we had that existed, especially between 1924 and 1965, was revised to favor mass immigration of non-Western peoples with the Immigration Act of 1965. The first thing I'd mention is that the current situation, where even within that horizon the law is not enforced, you see the undermining of the rule of law. No one has attempted to seriously enforce the most recent law that's tried to deal with this issue, the 1986 law from Reagan on. No one's bothered. It's actually gotten worse under Bush and Obama. And what this means in practice is the denial of equality, the equality of actual American citizens, because that was a law made by our representatives. It's still on the books. No one has had the courage to actually change it as of yet. The people's representatives made the law, but our enforcement has always been lax and has recently gotten much worse. Basically, you can't have democracy if you don't have to bother with the laws, is the point I'm making. How's that going to work? The second point, where the current situation is, I think, pernicious, American rights are violated or threatened, violated and threatened by the current situation. I'll give you some examples. Nidal Hasan and the Tsarnaev brothers. So Nidal Hasan, the Fort Hood shooter who murdered 13 of his fellow American citizens, he's here because of the post-1965 situation. The Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston bombers, they're here because of the post-1965 situation. Just yesterday it came out that dozens of terrorists have been admitted as refugees to America. A number of bomb plots have been uncovered and things like that, admitted as part of the 1965, post-1965 situation. This lawlessness is depicted in the popular culture in shows like Breaking Bad. If you're familiar with that, I don't know if I could really recommend it. It's pretty nasty, but it does show a reality. No Country for Old Men, and Border Wars, if you're into reality TV. You'll notice none of these shows are set along the Canadian border. They really wouldn't make sense in that venue. Third, I'd argue the current situation undermines the common beliefs and culture necessary to make genuine community a reality. There's a nice quote from Federalist 2 I'll mention here. John Jay says, "It has often given me pleasure to observe that independent America was not composed of detached and distant territories, but then one connected, fertile, wide-spreading country was the portion of our Western Sons of Liberty. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence." Jay concludes, "This country and this people seem to have been made for each other." But you have to have some things in common to make community work. Common beliefs. Can really only assimilate small numbers of people who don't have those beliefs, who don't speak the language or something like that. Jefferson makes a nice point, if you want, I won't quote this, but if you want to look at Query 8 of Notes in the State of Virginia, where he's talking about immigration, and he says, well, people, makes this common sense point, which seems to have been forgotten in our day, that people bring their culture with them, you might say, the moral habits they've imbibed, and he points out it would be bad for France if a couple million Americans up and moved there, because it would disrupt. It's not that Jefferson was anti-American or he's saying that this is, or anti-anybody. He's saying that's simply a fact you have to deal with. You're going to alter the culture you're in, and that's often going to be pernicious. The earlier view, to summarize how it would relate to this point of common culture, was that immigration was encouraged insofar as it's good for us, the America. That's what our social compact is for. Citizenship was restricted to those who would make good citizens, at least insofar as you can provide for that by law. The fourth point I would make, there's a lot of confusion here, there's no right to immigrate, at least under the earlier view of justice that prevailed in America. The social compact is and has to be, if it's to work, exclusive. Equal citizens consent or compact with each other to secure their rights. So in other words, there's no harm to those who are not allowed into our social compact. I don't have a right to immigrate anywhere else in the world, and no one else has a right, by the nature of things, to immigrate into our social compact. An example of how if you didn't have that, you couldn't have any private associations at all, let alone countries or sovereignty. The equivalent would be, well, I've decided I like this family down the street and I want to join it, I'm moving in. And they really don't, you know, it's going to be good for me, I'm going to have a better life there. I'm a terrible cook, there's no one to provide for me, and I bet I could find people who take better care of me if only they would not exclude me. And you know, it's, of course everybody knows that's idiocy, and when it's put that way, it's the same point. Next, immigration and capitalism, which is one of the most cancerous phenomena of our body politic today. I'll give you one example that poisons private organizations too who participate in this. Catholic Charities takes in about $3 billion a year from the federal government to do things, refugee resettlement services and things like that, which corrupts them, extortion of taxpayer money. Mark Zuckerberg is another example. He's lobbying. He cannot find any Americans who know anything about computer programming, apparently. We need to import foreign computer programmers who will do the job you lazy people in this room just can't be bothered to do. He's not wealthy enough. Next, the current situation undermines the possibility of free government and free markets. As I mentioned this at the beginning, basically, recent immigrants to America vote overwhelmingly, about 75% for Democrats. And this is not because the Democrats are the parties that favor amnesty. Polls show, groups say Hispanics, when they're polled, will say 5% are actually concerned about amnesty as an important political issue. Immigrants favor big government. So it's the same polls will show that Hispanics, when they were asked after the most recent election, what do you think about the Obamacare contraception mandates? 68% said it's a great thing. 75% said we need a bigger government, we'll do more. Immigrants also are unfortunately disproportionately on welfare and have high incarceration rate, higher than the native-born population. Last, we don't need more workers of any sort right now. We have a very high unemployment rate and an incredibly high, incredibly high percentage of our population not participating in the labor force, period. We're not looking for more people to come in and work.
Your time has expired. You'll have a chance to respond after Mr. Butler speaks.
Thanks, Jack.
I want to thank Jack for putting on this event. I think this is great that this is going on. I'm also going to shamelessly plug my website, iloveecon.com right now. Right. So just like a bunch of stuff that I cite and most of the information I'm drawing from, if you guys want to go check it out and check out my sources, you're more than welcome to. I think it's important to kind of frame this discussion on whether open borders immigration is a good thing or not. We have to ask ourselves, why might people want to immigrate to the U.S.? There's a lot of the world that say lives on less than $1 a day. There has to be a reason that thousands of people have died trying to get into the U.S. So we had a reference to Breaking Bad and the drug culture. So the question there is, are immigrants inherently violent and interested in drugs, or is it drug policy that's driving some of that violence? So that's an important question to ask leading into that. But there's some reliable estimates and some good scholars out there who think that world GDP could double if we had open borders in the world. Meaning if people are allowed to move freely from countries that don't, say, have good government or good rule of law into countries where they can be more productive, we might be able to increase the standard of living. So if we look at it from that point of view, why would we want to prevent people from coming in and increasing their life expectancy, the well-being of their children? So when we're keeping them out, we're effectively saying, no, you stay where you're at and keep earning and keep your limited options. So it's important for me to look at it from that point of view. And I'm gonna try to approach, I have like 3 or 4 main objections to immigration that are common, and then during the Q&A we can get into more stuff and hopefully we'll debate a few more ideas that I heard. But my points are going to be twofold. First is the common or what I consider misconceptions, or the common objections just simply aren't true. And then the second point would be immigration policy. If we're going to put up more barriers for people coming in, maybe there's a cheaper and more humane solution available. So hopefully these will make more sense in a minute. So the first one is the South Park. You watch South Park. So they took our jobs. Right? Currently, there's a high rate of unemployment. We're worried about the wages of native-born Americans. Right? So if you take Econ 202, the story is relatively simple. People come in, supply of labor shifts to the right or shifts out. The price of labor goes down. People get paid less. Right? But if we're thinking about that, and usually the objection is to low-skilled labor, because currently high-skilled labor, it's a little bit easier to immigrate if you're a professor or a high-skilled person. You can open a job and get a visa a little bit easier. So typically this argument takes on the form of low-skilled. So who has the most to lose? Not all labor is the same, right? So professors are different from, just say, migrant farm workers, for example. Those are two different types of labor. Dr. Arndt isn't worried about an immigrant coming in and becoming president of Hillsdale College for less money. Right? That's not the concern that's floating around when we typically think about it. So the unemployment rate is highest amongst high school dropouts. Right? Like that's what we're competing with when we let most of the immigration, low-skill immigration in. So George Borjas, who's a professor at Harvard, he's done a bunch of work. He's considered like the leading authority on the opponent to immigration. Right? By his own estimates, the long-run effect on high school dropouts' wages is 5%. Right? So if we're going to talk about magnitudes here, we're talking about a very small effect on people that have decided to drop out of a free education in high school. So if we're worried about wages, maybe like that's not exactly a huge effect. And then if you look at other estimates, they get closer to zero. Right? It's reasonable to think that there's zero effect. Because the other thing, when you shift out supply, there's also a shift to demand for things like housing, things like food. Right? People who come here are also going to need things as well. So we're not dealing with a strictly fixed amount of things that we need to be producing. And then my second objection to this is the practical approach. So if we really are worried about immigrants coming in and lowering wages and taking jobs, while this may not be a perfect program, we can just charge them a fee to come in. Certainly we could just charge them $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, pick your number, and then we just transfer that money to those who are going to be affected. So say low-skilled high school dropouts would get that transfer. So while that may not be a perfect solution, I would say it's definitely more humane to give people the option to pay and come in. No one would be worse off, and the people who have come into the United States could be made better off. And it's also important, there's a lot of innovation coming from those who come into our country. So 40% of the companies in the Fortune 100 were either started by immigrants or first-generation children. 52% of the companies in Silicon Valley, which created thousands of jobs and lots of wealth in the United States, between 1995 and 2005, 52% were created by immigrants. Right? So we have there's a strong history in the United States of immigrants coming here and taking advantage of the opportunities presented to them, which I think we can all agree the iPhone has made us all better off. Different software programs have made us better off. Right? They're playing a major role in all these things that we consider to be good. One of the next major complaints is that the welfare program is going to be overrun by people coming here to take advantage of our social welfare net. Again, we can go back to some of George Borjas's work. He looks at the amount of social welfare programs that Americans natives take advantage of, not Native Americans, right? And that immigrants take advantage of, right? And he finds his biggest estimate, from what I could tell, is about 6%. Right? He also has estimates about $5,000 for the family over the course of their life here in America. So it's a very small, again, it's this very small change, right? It's not as if immigrants are 90% more likely to go on welfare than natives. It's a very small effect, and you can find a bunch of studies, including the National Research Council has found that immigrants and their children are estimated to pay $20,000 to $80,000 more in taxes than they receive in benefits during their lifetime. So at worst, it's 6%. At best, they're net payers. So we can argue research all day. But the point of it is that there's this very small gap, even if there is one, compared to native-born Americans. And then there's also the other point to consider is that most of the social welfare transfers in America are transfers from the young working class to the old, and most immigrants tend to be young. Right? So if we think about how big Social Security is and how big Medicare is part of the federal budget, those are huge chunks. Right? Young immigrants wouldn't be available to participate in those programs, and like if we're honest about it on some level, like we're not going to benefit that much from Social Security either. Right? So I mean, we have to consider that. And then at the end of the day, there's also the more humane option of you want to come into the United States, worry about the social welfare net, you're simply just not eligible. Right? We make that a condition upon your entry into the country. And then the third, which I'm going to kind of combine the two, is politics and culture. So the idea is that people come into the U.S., They're not aware of like what limited government is. Maybe they're just going to vote themselves more benefits in the future. To the best of my knowledge, there's not any really good data on this. We referenced some polling data. Polling data can be very interesting. But if we look at how likely immigrants are to vote, it turns out they're less likely to vote than their native counterparts. So, for example, in California, 26% of the adult population is Hispanics. They represent 18% of the citizen population, meaning they can vote, but they only represent 14% of the voting population. Right? And there's also this presumption of their political affiliation to one party or the other. It could just be it's a status quo thing. Where they move, they just pick up the social norms of those they live around them. Right? And also this idea that the status quo and they don't want to rock the boat, in other words. And also, so like another simple, easy solution if you're concerned about the political sphere being overrun by a bunch of people coming into the country. There's also a simpler and more humane solution, right? It's just don't allow first or second generation immigrants the right to vote, right? So if we're worried about that, that's the solution until maybe they can go through the public school system or go to like some great Hillsdale Academy, right, and be educated about the wonders of limited government. And then, so this like also goes into the culture question. It's kind of unclear what we mean by culture. And this effect on our communities and neighborhoods. So I think this is like a really hard thing to measure, but I think one good way to measure it is looking at where people like to live and rent. I think that's a really good proxy for what we can say about the value of culture and community. So here in Hillsdale, there's not necessarily a ton of culture in the sense of a lot of diversity. There's not a huge immigrant population. We know where there is, places like New York and LA. People like to live in those places. Right? They like the different foods, they like the different things going on around them, they like the arts. All those things are happening in places where there is the highest percentage of immigrants. Right? So if they were really ruining culture and ruining the places that they were living, we expect people to be moving from there elsewhere. Right? We expect a huge influx of people to Hillsdale. Right? It's a huge homogeneous community. So again, I find many of the critiques of open borders they don't meet the evidence test, right? We can go to George Borjas, professor at Harvard. He's a really well-respected opponent. His estimates, very small change. We can find studies that say there isn't. And then there's often a simpler, easier mechanism by which we can let some people in and they can benefit from having freer markets or the good rule of law.
Your time has expired.
We can.
We'll get a chance to respond after Dr. Grant. You get 5 minutes to respond.
Just start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're going to have some dueling data here, so I don't know how we sort that out, but the studies I found, one study from the Center for Immigration Studies, 57% of immigrant homes in 2009 were receiving a form of welfare. That was versus 39% of native-born homes in that time. 52% of homes headed by legal immigrants were receiving welfare. 71% of homes headed by illegal immigrants were receiving welfare. Yes, that's right, illegal immigrants, although the law is you're not allowed to come into the country if you're likely to be a public charge, but so much for the law. That just disappears, I notice in these things. In fact, this is all massive law breaking and the effects that has on our character in these discussions. Crime, let's talk about crime. This is from 2012. More than 9% of all murderers, 31% of all drug traffickers, 49% of all kidnappers, 31% of all money launderers, 17% of all auto thieves, and 24% of all federal level fraudsters sentenced that year were non-citizens. That's a lot of crime committed by non-citizens. And having lived in a vibrant community, which I was hearing that's a great place to live. I lived in Dallas, Texas for 17 years. And there were some troubling things. I like the nice restaurants, that's true. That's something you get as a consequence of this. But you also get a lot more crime. You have transformation of neighborhoods, gangs that didn't exist before. You get all those things in these vibrant communities. Now, the causes of what's been happening with American wages are complicated, but and so how you assign that to immigration or not, you do have massive population increase due to immigration. it's not just the people who've been hardest hit since 1970 in terms of their earning capacity are those without a high school degree, as Professor Butler noted. We've seen a 2/3 drop in their purchasing power since then. People with some college, which is the median in the U.S., have experienced a 1/3 drop in their actual value of their wages since 1970. So that's not just people who are checking out of a free public education. That's the median. That's, in other words, the middle class. Now, an honest presentation, I found a very honest presentation of how this works from Tyler Cowen, who many of you might be familiar with, is a noted economist at George Mason. And he admits, yeah, you're going to have a much smaller middle class with a lot less purchasing power, and what you need to do is learn to eat beans and tortillas, because that's what the rest of the poor people in the world do. And that parallels a suggestion by Tom Friedman, who's not a libertarian, unlike Professor Cowen, which is you regular Americans need to rent out rooms and get second jobs if you want to be in the middle class. That's your future, and that's good for you. Professor Friedman lives in a very large mansion, by the way. You can see pictures of it on Google Maps. It's bigger than the block on which I live, but he's okay with the rest of us. Grant, you just go ahead, you in your house, and you'll get along just fine. In terms of people, there's a lot of poverty in the world. That's true. If you look at where most of our immigration comes from, say, let's take Mexico, which is obviously a large source of our immigration. Mexico has a higher obesity rate in its population than America does, which is really saying something because America has quite an obesity problem. That's not a mark of grinding, terrible poverty. Mexico is a country that's rich in natural resources. It's got a lot of benefits. One thing people could do, rather than simply eliminating all borders, is stay in their own country and improve it. And one of the cruelties of the current situation is it's a safety valve where you don't have to improve these, where corrupt crony capitalism or worse in these countries can persist because they can allow people to flee to other places like America rather than reform their own countries. Work to do that. Mexican immigration to America picked up very heavily after a massive recession in Mexico in the early 1980s. So rather than reform their own economic system, it will allow people to go north and send their paychecks back south of the border. And also on the open borders thing, it's funny, I don't know of any other countries outside of the Western world that's asked to have open borders. There's no possibility that Russia's going to have open borders or China. And by the way, Mexico does not have open borders. If Guatemala is poorer than Mexico, Guatemalans trying to get into Mexico are rigorously stopped, and the U.S. government is currently helping the Mexican government build effective border security for their southern border. So it's not that we're not going to have the argument for open borders. That's not going to be everywhere. That means people in select countries like the United States can have these benefits, which if it's good for everybody, I wish it would be applied for everybody, not just a few countries like the United States, like Great Britain.
Yep, your time has expired. Mr. Butler, go ahead.
Man, that time just flies by when you're not sitting in the audience.
Yeah.
Just quick though. So I mean, on the topic of wages, if our fear is that immigrants will come in, we're going to experience lower wages. We don't also have the same rhetoric of, oh no, we can't allow more bulldozers into the country. We can't build more bulldozers because people who dig ditches are going to experience lower wages and be put out of work as a result. So we don't accept that argument. So why should we accept the argument we need to worry about the lowering of wages because more people are willing to offer their labor? It's a two-sided street there. Prices will reflect, if someone's willing to do something for a lower price, it's a voluntary exchange. Free markets are going to make everyone better off. Yep, is that bad for the person who was earning more before? In the short run, yeah, but in the long run, as an economy as a whole, we're all going to benefit. He briefly touched on the terrorism topic and the crime topic. If you notice, lots of those crimes are related to, say, the illegal drug trade, right? So it might not be that immigrants per se are more likely to commit crimes. It could be that there's more crimes surrounding drugs and gangs, right? So that's an important distinction to make there. And if you look at the incarceration rate as a whole, I'm sure he has his numbers saying it's really high. I've also seen a lot of numbers where it's a lot lower than the native population. So that's important to keep in mind. On the topic of terrorism, the question is, are we going to keep highly motivated people outside the United States? So as a simple thought experiment, if I had $100,000 in a bank account for the first one of you to successfully cross the border, say both of the Mexican and Canadian border, getting in and out without going through security, how many of you think you could accomplish that feat? Would it be really hard to do? Would it be really easy to do? Would it be worth $100,000, right? Is it plausible that you would be able to accomplish that? Considering the amount of the drug trade and that millions of people have been able to do it to date, while we've been slightly proactive, spending about $90 billion in the last decade trying to keep people out, what's the likelihood we're going to keep terrorists and bad people out? We're only keeping the good people out in some sense. That is all I have for now. I'm interested in the Q&A, okay. So I'm going to yield the remainder of my time.
All right, at this time, we'll open up the debate to questions from the audience. You can address your questions. I'm spry. Either to both participants or to one, either way. Yeah, in the back.
I'm from California, and as you can see, I'm a black person. And this issue is very big for black Californians. There's been a huge exodus out of California because of the immigration problem. The LAPD says that the majority of hate crimes that are committed are against from Latinos onto black people in Los Angeles. And so Professor Butler, in your whole discussion, you only talked about what was good for the Latino community in coming to the United States. You never talked about how is this benefiting ordinary Americans, and I think immigration is actually really hurting certain communities. So.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like easy to say free trade benefits all. Right? When you have more people providing goods and services, the price of goods and services will go down. The price of things that we buy every day might go down. There's innovation going on in Silicon Valley. That's a very valuable thing. I would think we want that occurring close to home if possible. The other thing related to the crime is I think there's this availability bias going on. So in the news, people pay attention to when you had a very few specific examples of immigrants committing heinous crimes, right? And those tend to stick with us versus when like some 20-year-old white kid goes out and kills someone, right? They're both heinous crimes, but when you attach the word immigrant to it, we tend to think that it happens more often than not. And I'm not denying that. I'm not denying it might be more prevalent.
LAPD data that I'm talking about, so it's not like news stories.
Yep. And I guess my rebuttal to that would be maybe within LA that's true, right? But there might be a lot of other factors going on within LA, and we can't extrapolate that and say all immigrants are prone to commit a lot of violence.
Evan?
Okay, so my question is for Professor Butler, and you said that if there was open borders that the GDP of the world could possibly double because people could go to other countries where their labor would be more effective. Was that your point? So what I would ask you is then, how if there's open borders, wouldn't the culture of the world become more homogenous, so there would be less great countries and less not so great countries, and then how would that argument mean anything, because the country is just kind of this probably lower mean where the whole world is a little bit less effective instead of countries that are more effective or less effective. Therefore, the GDP possibly wouldn't go up because there aren't places that are better. What would you say to that?
So what do you mean by culture and everything would kind of become...
Well, just homogenize, because if there's open borders, then anybody could come to America, anybody could leave to Mexico, and so people would spread out, and then they would leave certain places, and they would kind of come and they would centralize in certain countries like America or Great Britain, and then the culture would be destroyed, and it would just be something different. And
So my argument is it's not clear what do you mean by culture being different. If you mean by we have less secure property rights and the rule of law is destroyed and the things which make free markets function, the institutions that are important for that's why America has such a high GDP per capita, right? We have all of these things in droves compared to the rest of the world. So I guess from my point of view, if you have a strong limited government, which was one of Jack's questions that he sent out, and rule of law, I don't see why that has to be the case. Will culture look different? Will Seinfeld still be Seinfeld? Maybe not. Right? But it's not clear to me that we have to give up property rights and all these other institutions along with admitting more people into the U.S. I mean, the population of the U.S. has grown dramatically throughout its history, so it's not clear that, it's, in some sense, the Constitution is a public good. My reading and understanding and appreciating the Constitution doesn't affect your ability to follow the Constitution. So, I mean, it's not clear that that would be the case, I guess would be my
Dr.
take
Ben,
on
would
that.
you like to respond?
I mean, I just noticed that moral character just disappears in this. Everybody's treated as if they're just interchangeable economic units and workers and that. So that's just. I mean, just looking at the headlines, you can see that's different. I mean, you're looking at the news, looking at the history, and look at all of human experience goes against this. Look at how open borders worked for Rome. How did that work? Did that bring economic innovation? I mean, come on. That just seems to me to be incredibly abstract from reality, I guess you'd say.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, so I mean, the other way to look at this is, do we go around judging people? And I don't mean to pick on people, but like Luke Hickman, he's of loose moral character. His supply of labor after he leaves college is going to lower Americans' wages. Therefore, we should kick him out of the country because I worry about what he's doing to our culture. I mean, in fact, like we're kind of saying the same thing. Just because they weren't here to begin with, we're keeping them out for that reason. So if we can keep people out, why should we let them stay if they're degrading our way of life?
Because they're citizens, and they're citizens. There's a difference between citizens and non-citizens in the Constitution, which is a public good, which we should maintain.
All right.
Citizens have privileges and immunities of citizenship.
All right, let's move on to another question. Dr. Steele?
So, yeah, I've got it is actually for both of you, although it has to be phrased a little differently, so I want to try to do that. So, Lewis, or Professor Butler, you're saying, Lewis.
Yes.
So, you keep saying things like, well, that's actually just, we have these immigrants coming in, but it's really just a problem of the drug war or something like that.
Yeah.
And, well, they might vote for welfare, but that's really the problem of the welfare state or something like that. So if government is properly constrained, that's what you're saying is a precondition to have open borders, if it's properly constrained. So, for example, people can't come in. You'd be comfortable, I assume you'd not be comfortable with people coming in and moving into a community and voting for Sharia.
Correct. So,
and to phrase this then for Professor Grant, Dr. Grant, John. All three of you. If government were properly constrained, and you couldn't come in and vote yourself welfare and things like that, doesn't that really change your argument? Or aren't you then much more comfortable with immigration? And just as a footnote, I want to say that I think that I won't give a footnote yet, but I think some of your numbers are wrong on economics.
So I said, limited government is a precondition for this to work, at least like en masse, right? But what I'm also saying is if you go and look at the data, even the most respected opponents to open borders, at least in the economics literature, they're finding very small effects, right? So they're finding immigrants might be 6% more likely to be on social welfare programs, right? So I guess I'm fighting against the conception that all immigrants are going to come in and just instantly go on welfare versus going and finding a job or being a taxpayer. Right? So I'm saying, first of all, the effects are very small if they're to be believed. There's reasons to believe that there's no effects. And even if we can't get over that barrier, then yes, we'll just truncate that by saying we'll just have a law, or we'll make a condition of them coming into the country.
So my question was, is it a precondition? Because I think that what we're seeing now is very different. What we could see in the future is going to be a very different kind of immigration because we're coming into a very different, fundamentally changing system right now, not changing the right way.
I would agree with you on that, but I would add that let's pretend for a second that we're going to have mass immigration into the U.S. Would that change public perception and public support of current welfare programs? My gut feeling is yes. Right? Current people who might be on the fence about whether social welfare programs are good or not might be willing to, shut down those programs a little bit more.
If people were rational actors, maybe. I'd be a lot more comfortable with it if we didn't have a massive welfare state. then you wouldn't have a lot of these problems. You'd still have the problem of it. You say you have. I mean, you rightly say you have to have property rights and the rule of law. That comes out of a certain character. That doesn't happen just out of nowhere. You have to have a certain moral character in the populace, and that has to be looked at too in immigration policy. So it would be better, but you'd still have that problem. You'd have to be very cautious about allowing people in who come from countries. And I mean, the statistics, we can fight about the statistics. I've been to Parkland Hospital. I used to have a job, it's a public hospital in Dallas. Go to Parkland Hospital on Friday night and tell me immigrants are not high consumers of free medical care. It's just simply not the case. Or crime, or, I mean, I'm kind of in shock having lived in one of these vibrant communities, and that welfare rate is very high, and these are real problems. It's striking. That's a reality.
In the back by the door.
This is for Professor Butler.
You guys can pick on him too, you know.
Please do.
Yeah, it's good for me.
When I walked in, you were proposing some possible compromises to kind of put the fears at bay of people who would be kind of not okay with open borders. Things like having a rule where if you were a first or second generation, you couldn't vote, or just you simply don't qualify for the government benefits. How do you propose that would be enforced?
I mean, how do we currently enforce whether you can vote or not? You have to go register to vote.
I just don't see that being.
You don't see that being practical, or?
Oh no, I mean when you look at in a place where there's still a lot of voter fraud going on and things, and also how are we enforcing our borders today? How will we even keep track of something like that if it's over?
We make it simple and low cost to become a citizen or get specific rights, like migrant worker program. We currently have a visa program. I don't pretend to know the technicalities of how this would work. I'm just saying that solution, however imperfect it might be, would be preferable to the current state where we say, no, no matter how badly you want to come into the United States and work or raise a family, we're not going to let you do that.
Dr. Grant, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned voter registration. That's not enforced. I mean, you can't ask people for proof of citizenship. That's a great example of how this is going to work if we have open borders.
In the back, green shirt, red hair.
Question for Dr. Grant. You're making a point about how rule of law is absolutely necessary for the long-term survival of the republic, and I agree with that, which is why I have to ask, if you want the federal government to be taking active steps to limit immigration, or just in general have the power to dictate who can and cannot come into the country, I'm not sure where in the Constitution there's provision for such powers. Could you?
Congress has an enumerated power to define rules for naturalization in Article 1, Section 8. And one of the first laws passed by Congress.
Rather than residency, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's naturalization specifically concerns citizenship. Congress's power to define the law of nations.
What about residency?
Yeah, I mean, Congress's power to define the law of nations. Controlling your borders is an attribute of sovereignty. So Congress's power to define the law of nations, another enumerated power, is how that was understood.
In the middle, blue vest.
This is a question for both of you, but in terms of open borders, one quick thing I want to just preface with this: would you consider refugees crossing from one country that's in conflict into another a form of open borders by that country that is allowing those refugees to come in? Would you define that as a form of allowing for open borders? Okay. There have been examples where in the Pakistani conflict with East Pakistan, a lot of refugees came into India, and there's been evidence that it destabilized the Indian economy in that regard. There's also evidence where a lot of people that are not readily able to assimilate into those cultures, if you look at Algeria and France, for example, where a lot of Algerian immigrants go into France, they destabilize some of the cultural aspects and economic aspects of those nations. So I guess my question is, how do you readily assimilate those people into a culture without having those effects happen? Because I would say that across the board there's evidence that large influxes of foreign nationals into a nation that has this homogenous society that has an established set of laws allows these people to come in. They don't assimilate either very well or very readily, and therefore destabilize a lot of what's been established already.
I'll start. I pretty much agree with that being a problem, what you described. That is a real problem. And the history of immigration in America is not one of easy assimilation. I mean, this has been a contentious political issue for a long time. I mean, in the 1840s, immigration was a big issue because of the fact that Irish immigration, which the Democrats liked, they tended to come in and vote Democratic, and that's why they supported that. I mean, that might be good or bad, but that's you always have that issue. So the Whigs and the Republicans were opposed, the Democrats liked it, and that's an issue. The massive immigration of people from Southern and Eastern Europe between the 1880s and 1924, when that got stopped, helped to get FDR elected 4 times. So yeah, there's issues with that.
So, I mean, you might consider this a cop-out, like my preference is for open borders, right? But the better than now point would be figure out some way to screen that out, right? Figure out a culture test, figure out some way, maybe there's a panel somewhere. I'm not saying this is the perfect way, but clearly there are some people that are currently being kept out that would do us no harm, right? And if it's true, like these people would very clearly do us harm, then let's screen those and keep those people out. All I'm saying is, like, it'd be preferable to open the door 6 inches rather than keep it slammed shut.
Buffalo Track
Trace.
Trace.
Suburban. Technical today. This is primarily for Professor Butler, because I think I know Professor Grant's thoughts well on the matter, but I'd like to hear from both of you. It seems to me that on our southern border we have a Hobbesian state of darkness. So Mexico is a completely failed state. They can't maintain law and order. So in my thinking, to write off the ills there as just a problem with the drug culture, or just a problem of gangs, is problematic because they're presiding over a failed state. So doesn't the character of these people presiding over a failed state matter, that we're looking to introduce here?
I would say it's a matter of how strong your institutions are. I mean, I think it's very dangerous to universally say, or in mass to say, current citizens of Mexico don't know how to rule themselves, and they don't respond to incentives, and they don't want material well-being. Some of them might, that's like a reason for them to come here, right? Millions of them have come here over the last decades. California may not be like a utopia that we would all envision, right? But it's far from what I consider chaos and a failed state. So, I mean, there's bits of evidence in there somewhere.
Go ahead, Dr. Grant.
Victor Davis Hanson has a couple good pieces, well, a book, Mexifornia, but a couple good pieces too, describing the difference between the coastal enclaves, where basically wealthy white people hang out with each other, and the rest of the state, which is pretty grim in a lot of ways. And he says it looks like a third world country. Now, I'm no expert on California, but that was Jefferson's point. People bring their habits with them, and it's hard to get away from it. It takes a long time. And also, we have a massive welfare state now, which only grows and grows, which I think Professor Butler and I would be in perfect agreement. That's a bad thing, but it is a fact right now that it is growing and growing. It's not a free market situation. So we're talking about free markets. We're not in a free market situation. Is the problem? I wish we were. That would make this easier, but we're not. I don't see any prospects for that right in the immediate future. Actually, we're moving farther from that with this tendency.
Grand Canyon.
I have a name, Jack.
I don't know who you are.
He's not just a shirt.
Yeah. So this is kind of a twofold question to each of you. First, to Dr. Grant, I'm from Sweden. So what we've had in the past 20 years is this giant influx of a lot of refugees from Islam countries in the Middle East. And in lieu of what Dr. Butler was saying earlier, what's happened as a result, particularly in the past couple of years, is government has, people have gotten it to slowly privatize, for instance, the health insurance industry just a little more. And I think that's a response of people just getting frustrated with immigrants absorbing a lot of the benefits. So first, how does that change your perception on the matter? And then to Dr. Butler, also regarding the influx of immigrants, we had a bunch of Stockholm riots over the summer,
And a lot of Swedish natives are arguing, well, this is a perfect example of why we shouldn't have open borders, and how does that change your perception on the matter? So
I'll go first. I mean, yeah, I don't know if immigrants are allowed to vote in Sweden when they arrive, or how that works. I'm not sure what dynamic that would have in there, but that could happen. It's a possible solution where you'd have a sort of a backlash and say, well, we need to cut back in the welfare state because of people coming in. I haven't seen that yet. I mean, and we have an awful lot of recent immigrants in this country, so expansion is the welfare state. I mean, even when I was a kid, you didn't have Obama. Well, they didn't have cell phones, so that's not a good example. But at a little more limited, welfare than you have now. That's just grown and grown and grown. So, sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
So what was the follow-up question? What were the riots in response to benefits being taken away, or what was the?
It was about income inequality, and they felt that they weren't properly accounted for by the welfare system, and that they should have more benefits. And the details get really muddled along the way, but I'm sort of playing devil's advocate and just asking how are you to prevent, if you have open borders, isn't there a risk that you have?
So your question is, how do you sell this idea? Is that it's really not, I don't know if I knew how to sell everyone on open borders and how to prevent all the rioting in the streets, like I would be pushing this idea a lot harder, right? So I don't know if I have a good answer for that.
Matt, in the back.
So it seems from the discussion, you admitted that some type of screen to prevent some of the bad things that Dr. Grant mentioned from some of these people from coming in, and I'm sure Dr. Grant would, some of the people who have come here and started productive companies and really added to society, I'm sure he would agree that some system that allows them to become citizens or to somehow work in our country, that's a good thing. So I guess where I see the conflict and what I'd like to know is at what point, what type of, and not that you should give an exact test, but Dr. Grant, at what point is someone, like, what would you like to see in that test to decide between whether or not someone can come in and come out? And Professor Butler, at what point is it too restrictive? So it seems like the important thing here is whether or not whatever we're using to screen, whether or not people can come in, at what point is it too restrictive and at what point is it too loose?
So I see the screen as not my primary position. I see it as like a fallback position, right? So even if, because I currently don't see us being able to keep out people who really want to get in. I think if you really want to get in, you're going to get in. If you really want to do a bunch of harm, you're going to come in and do it. So I don't see the screening as necessarily an ideal solution. I see it as a fallback position. So I guess in my opinion, anything that's less restrictive than the current policy is an improvement, and I would favor that over nothing.
Dr. Grant?
Well, first, I don't know why we can't secure our borders. We secured our borders for a very long time with much less technology than we have now. We can build an iPhone which has more computing power than a Cray supercomputer did in the 1970s, but we can't do something that nations have done for time out of mind, and that large nations still do today. I don't think that's correct, but anyway, I think that the question is, what's good for the current American citizens? That's who the Constitution covers. We're not here to benefit the rest of the world. We should respect the rights of the rest of the world. The flip side of this is our invade the world mentality, which would probably be broad agreement on in this with that's bad, and I agree with it. And this is the other side of it. So let's invite the world. Well, I'd say we should do neither. We don't need that. America had a massive increase in wealth without an open borders policy. Say after the Civil War and before World War I, and between after World War II and before 1965. It's not that you can't have wealth and innovation and things like that with our existing populace. I like our existing populace. Hey, there's some smart people here with good character who want to work hard. What's the matter with them? Why do we need to elect a new people through massive immigration? That's my question. I like our existing people. Let's keep them.
This will be our last question before we move on to closing remarks. Sarah?
This is directed to both of you. I was wondering how would you characterize the rights and obligations of citizenship?
Whoever wants to start.
the ability to be an independent, good, a law-abiding member of society, not dependent, except in the ordinary sense on family and things like that, human being. That's really just the basic minimum, I think. So respect for the rights of others, able to take care of yourself and serve the public good in that way. Not the kind of demands you see today, but be able to contribute to the common good in that way.
I would say respect life, liberty, property. So you should do as a citizen. Outside of that, I think it's difficult to get everyone in agreement on stuff. So I would stop it there.
All right. Well, we will have closing remarks now. Each of you will get 3 minutes, just basically to wrap things up, mention anything that you wanted to mention earlier but couldn't get to. And since Dr. Grant started, we'll give him the chance to end. So, Lewis, you'll go first, and I'll get out of this.
Great. Again, I just want to thank everyone for coming. The questions were hopefully stimulate even more discussion. I guess I would take issue with this idea that we can secure the border. I think that's a monumental task. I think it's unlikely to succeed. Look how long the war on drugs has been going on. Millions of people have come across the border as is. So I don't necessarily see that as a attainable solution. I would also say I haven't persuaded you the fact that immigrants aren't likely to be a huge drain on the welfare state, or they aren't likely to be a threat to native-born wages. We can at least agree upon my compromise of they're allowed to come in and work and live here, but maybe we don't give them the right to vote, or maybe we charge them a fee to come in, or maybe we make them pass some sort of culture test. While I would personally love everyone in this room to run out and go to openborders.org and read all the information and email it to all of your friends, I realize that that's probably not going to happen. But at least, you referenced Tyler Cowen earlier. Just want to take small steps towards a better world. And if we go back to think about the typical people who are likely to want to come in, a large majority of them just want a better life for them and their families. So if we're going to keep them out, we need to be absolutely sure that they will be doing us harm. Like we need to be able to know with a great deal of certainty. It can't just be our guess best because we're currently tied into the status quo. We're fearful of what the future might hold. There's nothing that's saying if we change policy and bad things happen, so we can't change it back. So with that, I guess go open borders. Dr. Grant, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Butler. I think I'm still not sure why we can't secure the borders. Like I said, we've done that. That's basically saying we can't defend ourselves. It's another version of that. Is that really true, that it's impossible to defend our borders? Why we have demarcation lines between other countries? It seems like we could do a lot of things, but I think one way to look at this is let's fix the horrible problems we have in this country with the denial of our liberties, the massive welfare state, with the ongoing diminution of our freedoms. Every day seems to bring some new outrage, and I think the war on drugs is a massive catastrophe, an example of that. I don't think that's going. Open borders is not going to make that, or even ending that ending that war and then having open borders is not necessarily going to end the assault on our civil liberties. Those two things have gone together. You'll notice massive immigration, the massive immigration we've seen since 1965, and the diminution of our liberties have gone together. We have huge levels of legal and illegal immigration in this country. It's not bringing more freedom. Now, correlation and causation, I get that. It's not, but it's not obvious to me that embracing open borders is going to increase liberty. I think in our environment it's not going to. I think it'd be good if we went back to the thought about how do we fix the situation we have right now? How do we roll back the large government, intrusive government we have? That'd be a very good idea. I can't emphasize enough the moral character issue, that's you don't get the rule of law and the respect for rights, which we all agree is important, without a certain character. There's a reason why Somalia is a lawless, that's a real failed state. I have to disagree with you, Bill. Mexico looks like a garden paradise compared to Somalia. It's the reason any country has the problems it does, the long-term political problems it does, is the character of its citizens. Everything else is accidental and secondary. So that has to be factored in. It's not, well, people will come here and they'll sort of be marinated in mom and apple pie and baseball, and you'll have Liberty breakout. And that's not, that doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. And so I'm behind the times. I do not have a website, to my shame, but something you could read on this, which is a good account of the older view on it, is our own Professor Tom West has a chapter in his book, Vindicating the Founders, on immigration and moral character. And how you have to have the virtues associated with self-assertion and self-restraint to have freedom. That don't happen spontaneously. They have to be cultivated, and they're difficult to maintain. So that'd be something good to think about too. Thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you.